you have a problem that you need to solve. And you read a lot about this. 95% of startups fail because they solve a problem, but it's not a pressing or burning house problem.
Yeah.
And that actually, and the reason for sharing this is that is the thing that leads into, I'm going to dip in my pocket, I'm going to take my wallet out, and I'm going to pay you some money to go and solve this, because that is the hardest thing. If there are plenty of substitutes, if it's not big enough problem, if it's just a nice to have, which I've seen so many times, that is really the criticality. And that really has the sort of test, I think, at the very beginning of building anything, before you really go and dive into, sort of building something. Because it is a big sacrifice to go down that path.
I read a really good analogy about the definition of product market fit. If you cease to exist tomorrow, how many of your existing clients would come knocking on the door?
It's great. And I've also read the other day about idea market fit, which is the first instance. You have an idea that there could be a market fit, i.e., I think these people have this problem, and I think these people might be interested to go and buy it, and I think if I build this, it could solve it. The problem is getting from idea market fit to product market fit. And that is the difficulty, I think, that a lot of people have, because they stick with that idea. They think it's going to it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it really requires that depth of analysis and understanding of the customer that it's a real problem that they're going to pay for and solve. And you need to see that. That's really what you're looking out for, that someone's ultimately going to, press that button or put their hand in the wallet.
Sounds like after that LI with Lazada, with the furniture store, things quickly clicked into place. How much did that help in the next phase of, in a company which is often fundraising, expanding the team? Was it an easy process with Hoolah?
For fundraising or the general process of growth?
Fundraising.
Firstly, and quite transparently, it was my first time doing anything like that. I was very naive, I think, in what that looked like. Obviously you ask other people. Ironically now, a lot of people coming to me, asking me about how to do that. Now, I'm by no means an expert on it, but I've definitely sort of been through that, process. The first check was probably the hardest, but I think every step was actually quite difficult, but for different reasons. Purely, I think, because of the different requirements and the different positioning that ultimately each step requires. So, ideation, early traction at sort of pre-seed, seed, Series A, okay, we've definitely got something here. Let's put some more venture capital into this to really sort of go and scale and grow, this business. But here are the metrics that's proving that. And then Series B, okay, now we've really got to some scale. Let's go and really put the foot on the sort of accelerator. And that's kind of where we got to with Hoolah, was around that Series B. We were raising a Series B. And the investors also change. The narrative changes. The questions change around what it looks like. You're really sort of turning this from an idea now into, you're really looking at the financial metrics and performance of the business and some of those sort of key, facets of a real company and a real business. So it was none of it was easy at all, difficult for all different reasons. But the first check was arguably the hardest, because one, how do you value a company?
When there's nothing, right?
It was literally, finger in the air. And I've learned a little bit about, perhaps sort of some of that as well now. These days is even sort of, more difficult or different, at least, perhaps, just because the valuations are, there's a different way of looking things, I think, now, which is good as well. I think it's a really good thing. But I think a lot of the stuff that we'd done around validation, back to your question, some of the team members that we got on board at that point, a lot of the work we'd put in, I think, into the basic foundations of it, like a financial model, financial forecast, which my friend Andy, who became our CFO, did a lot of that at the beginning, and he was brilliant in supporting us in doing that. It really helped, I think, to cement that we've got an opportunity here. And that was really the starting point of getting that. And again, very fortunate to the investors that came in and supported us on that journey at the beginning.
It's so true that the seed or the pre-A round is actually most difficult, because how do you put a number when everything is just like 2 months of track record, 3 months of track record, right? And you really have to extrapolate to make them show some kind of hockey stick growth. Whereas in like later stage series where you have like 2-3 years of traction, it's a bit harder to then say, hey, this is the point where it's gonna, suddenly go exponential, right?
And you're always going to have that hockey stick in there. It's absolutely vital. If you didn't, you probably wouldn't be successful in fundraising. But it's almost proving, why is that going to happen? How can you defend against that? And these are all other startup questions you end up going through. What's your moat? What's your unfair competitive advantage? How are you going to compete? What does the competition in the market look like? What are the substitutes? What are the direct competitors? What happens if Afterpay comes into a number of times I heard that as well. And then it's ultimately, the research and the work you've done, the depth of detail that you've gone into, and the proof points perhaps, which is again, sort of the basics of selling, feature benefit proof, this is what we're doing, this is how it's going to happen. And here's the proof why we think we're going to be able to go and create a moat around the business.
Yeah. And we've heard many ways for people to want to start their own company, right? Some people say, start when you're young in school, you have no obligations. Some people say you get some work experience. There was even a report, the most successful founders, they split by age. They see that's like the 40 plus years, right? If someone listening right now, it's in the middle of a job, they've been there 5-10 years, but they always wanted to have a taste of the startup world, what do you think is the best way for them to really dip their toes into here?
So I think there's 2 or 3 ways of answering, this question. Number one, I think it's never the right time. Ironically, it never is. And it's also always the right time, i.e. if you've got a burning opportunity and idea, explore it.
Okay.
The challenges in doing it are really more, I think, on a personal level. I mean, for me, I absolutely went through it. At the time of building out Hoolah, I mean, I was in a reasonably good job. Traveling 2-3 weeks out of every 4, which made it really difficult to try and spend that time on putting these things together. It wasn't really until I sort of quit that job to go full time in trying to build the business where it really sort of started to take off, and we started to get some volition and momentum from an investor perspective and sort of feedback perspective to get to that outcome we were trying to get to. I'd also say, though, from that perspective, it's always good to have money coming in to go and test that. That validation doesn't need you doing it every day full time, I think. If you can do that whilst you've got money coming in, it's a really good place to be. Because especially being in Singapore, it's not the cheapest of places. I have been, living here with no income coming in for almost a year, which was, incredibly difficult and challenging to try and, make ends meet. And especially when you had no certainty around whether this was going to take off and whether you were going to fundraise, whether we were going to get money. We started putting targets in place, but you're so close, you don't want to, so close, that target sort of extends by a couple of months, your mind starts playing tricks with you. But I'm glad we did, because ultimately we got there. But
I think it was
very close.
That's the scary thing, especially in Singapore, for a good and a bad reason. The good reason is it's very safe, right? I tell a few friends that it's hard to be jobless in Singapore, it's hard to be homeless in Singapore, so you always know that there's a safety net. But the flip side is also true. If, let's say, you try this startup thing and it doesn't fly, 3-4 months of having no income, it's difficult, cost of living and everything. So I feel like we're sandwiched between these 2 extremes that makes it really hard to take that leap of faith. So if, let's say, I'm right now someone in a banking job, how do I kind of decide to dip my toes? You're saying that I should try and maybe take time after work, do a little bit of something, get some validation, get some, in the format of an LI or some kind of like sales, right?
Yeah.
How do I decide what's right for me? Should I go with something that I'm passionate about, or should I go to where capital is flowing to?
Well, that's a good one.
Because not every passion can be quote unquote monetizable.
Well, here's an example, and one how we connected.
Yep.
The Heroes business that we put a lot of effort into trying to sort of build the foundations of that, and it was a passion project, most definitely. But it was passionate because it impacted my life and, or at least my social group, so to speak. Actually, memories almost, or connections that I had, and it was something I felt quite strongly about. But it was definitely not a place where investment monies were going into. But then you ended up having to try and sort of, position it slightly differently. It's a fintech marketing platform, which it technically was, but ultimately the focus or the reason to exist was to solve something completely different.
Yeah.
And definitely that struggled, because it wasn't in the focus point maybe a year before, or perhaps if there was an AI component, which is maybe the the next part of that story anyway, as we've talked about numerous times. I think that maybe that would have then started to get some traction, because as you said, it's more of a popular sort of theme, and investors tend to work like that, right or wrong, and I understand why. There is a cycle. The cycle is around a particular theme.
Narrative.
Yeah, there is a narrative. There is money going into it. There is, if other people are putting capital into this, there is a future point of potential that you're investing into, and so you can understand why that happens. I mean, it makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
I don't think it's necessarily right or wrong, to go either way. Sometimes it's important to, perhaps think about actually how that technology that can be a component of whatever you're trying to sort of solve. Probably the next question is it a venture capital backed business anyway? You don't need to go and raise money.
That's true.
You can build a company doing whatever you want, buy low, sell high. I mean, it doesn't need to be some sort of tech platform to be able to do that. So an entrepreneurial, activities is not governed by just venture capital. It's governed by an intent to go and build something from nothing, because that's really all it is.
Yep.
Venture capital money is really just putting a bit of fuel on a fire, but the fire still exists.
Yeah.
Either way.
It's so interesting you brought up that example, because let's say when I just got out of college, my visualization of a startup is, Forbes, VC back, ABC closed 10 million. But I start to be envious about those companies that don't take VC money, 100% equity holders, and it's just a really good cash flow business. And sometimes this entrepreneurship, if you think about it, this entrepreneurship spirit, sometimes doesn't even have to accumulate in a startup. There are terms of like intrapreneur.
Yeah.
Can you launch a new vertical in an existing company, right? So I think that spirit is probably more important. The form, just maybe some of it seems a little bit more flashy. The news likes to report it, but that is so true, because you don't always have to go into what's the hype. AI is definitely the hype right now. You don't have to just do that. If you are passionate about a cleaning business, if you're passionate about sports for that matter, right? Like that, I think grants a lot of fulfillment as well.
To interject quickly.
Yeah, go for it.
I think the important thing, it kind of comes back to something we said earlier on, is just knowing that there is a problem to solve and it's big enough. Whether or not, whatever path you take, I think I've become a bit of a realist. Maybe I'm just sort of getting more miserable in my old age, but after my 30 years of experience. But it's really, I think, I get frustrated almost, I think, these days when I sort of see, the AI of this and Web3 of that. Yeah. Because it's really, the technology is almost irrelevant, at least at the front door of an opportunity. The opportunity is the problem you're trying to solve. The technology is really just a mechanism to solve that. That's how I've been in tech and sales for all of my career. I say this, and whoever is listening to this that might know might know what I'm like. I'm the one that they keep well away from the red button, because I'm the one that will probably break it and destroy everything and lose everything, because my relationship with technology is a stretch at best. But it's the value that technology, the opportunity, I think, is always seeing, how can I solve this? How can I make something that's going to really solve this problem at scale, and be worth the sacrifice to go and ultimately sort of achieve, what we want to achieve? How can I actually, even asking the questions, how can I build a competitive advantage around this? How can I make money out of it, fundamentally? Yep. So that's kind of, I think, the approach I sort of think.
Yep.